In the heart of the Pacific War, where heat, hunger, and death stalked every step, there was one name that sent a chill through the ranks of Japanese soldiers: the United States Marines. They were not the largest force in the American military, nor the best equipped, but their presence on an island meant one thing: a fight to the death. To the Japanese, who had been trained to see themselves as the ultimate warriors, it was a shocking revelation that anyone could match their ferocity. Yet the Marines did more than match it. They mirrored the Bushido spirit with a savage determination of their own, and that terrified the enemy in a way no other unit did. The Pacific Campaign was unlike any other theater of war. It was not fought over open plains or grand cities, but across volcanic islands, coral reefs, and jungles thick with heat and disease. Every inch of ground had to be taken with blood. The Japanese had prepared for this kind of warfare, convinced that Western soldiers lacked the will to fight in such brutal conditions. They had seen European armies crumble before fanatic charges and believed the Americans would be no different. But when the Marines arrived, everything changed. These were not soldiers who broke under pressure. They were men forged in relentless training, hardened by impossible missions and driven by a creed that left no room for surrender. The first encounter stunned the Japanese. The Marines didn't retreat when surrounded. They didn't surrender when outnumbered. They advanced through fire, mud, and chaos with a cold mechanical focus. Where others might have sought safety, the Marines sought the enemy. Even Japanese officers, schooled in the art of psychological dominance, began to whisper that these Americans were not ordinary men. They were something else entirely. Stories spread from island to island. Tales of Marines who fought even when wounded, who attacked in the dark, who refused to die quietly, for an enemy that prided itself on the warrior's spirit. It was both infuriating and terrifying to meet a force that lived by a code just as unyielding. By the time the war dragged deeper into the Pacific, the Japanese no longer underestimated the Marines. They hated fighting them, not because of cowardice, but because each battle against them became a nightmare that tested both body and soul. The Marines were relentless, and for the Japanese, that relentlessness was the true face of terror. Two warrior cultures collided in the Pacific, each molded by pride, discipline, and a belief in their own invincibility. On one side stood the Japanese Imperial Army, trained under the ancient code of Bushido, a philosophy that glorified sacrifice and demanded death before dishonor. Surrender was seen as the ultimate shame, a stain that could never be washed away. From their earliest days, Japanese soldiers were taught that their emperor was divine, that dying for him was the greatest honor a man could achieve, and that Western soldiers were soft, weak, and unwilling to face death. On the other side stood the United States Marines, forged in the crucible of brutal training camps where weakness was hunted down and destroyed. Their creed was simple: fight, endure, and never give an inch. They didn't fight for a god or an emperor. They fought for each other, for survival, and for victory. The clash between these two mentalities was inevitable, and when it came, it would shape the nature of the Pacific War. Japanese officers had long believed that the Western way of war, machines, artillery, and overwhelming numbers, would crumble when faced with true warriors who welcomed death. They expected Americans to break the moment hand-to-hand combat began, to run from the screams of banzai charges. What they encountered instead were men who fought with a fury that matched and often exceeded their own. The Marines had been trained to kill efficiently, to clear bunkers and trenches with cold precision, and to use fear as a weapon just as effectively as any rifle. The training that produced these men was unlike anything else in the American military. It broke down individuality and rebuilt it into a collective instinct for survival and aggression. Drill instructors screamed, punished, and pushed recruits past the limits of exhaustion, teaching them to act without hesitation under fire. Every Marine was taught that discipline was not just a rule, it was a shield. The enemy would be ruthless, so they must be ruthless first. By the time a Marine left boot camp, he had been molded into something relentless, something closer to a machine than a man. That transformation would prove essential in the hellish battles to come. Japanese soldiers, for their part, were also products of their nation's strict warrior culture. They endured savage discipline and deprivation, learning to live with hunger, disease, and pain. But where their training was built on emotional fervor and the promise of glorious death, Marine training was grounded in controlled aggression, teamwork, and adaptability. That difference became crucial when chaos erupted on the battlefield. Japanese troops fought with fanatical courage, but often lacked flexibility when plans collapsed. Marines, in contrast, thrived in the confusion. They turned adversity into momentum, improvising, flanking, and using every weapon at hand until the enemy broke. The Marines also brought something else that unsettled the Japanese, a dark, unshakable humor. In the mud and heat, surrounded by death, they laughed. They joked about dying, mocked their fear, and turned horror into determination. To the Japanese, this seemed insane, almost inhuman. Warriors were supposed to meet death with solemn dignity, not grin in its face. But this ability to absorb pain and mock despair gave the Marines a psychological edge. They could fight day after day under fire without losing their spirit. Even when supplies ran low and casualties mounted, the Marines kept coming, each man trusting that the one beside him would not falter. In those early months of contact, the Japanese learned a hard truth. They were not the only warriors willing to die. The Marines might not have been bound by Bushido, but they had their own code, a modern version of the same ancient spirit, stripped of ceremony and filled with raw, stubborn humanity. They didn't seek death, but they didn't fear it either. They fought not for abstract ideals, but for survival, for the brothers beside them, and for the promise that no matter the odds, they would never back down. And that realization, the understanding that these Americans could match their devotion and surpass their endurance, was the beginning of the fear that would haunt the Japanese across every island in the Pacific. The training that forged the U.S. Marines was not simply about learning to shoot or march, it was about transforming ordinary men into instruments of controlled destruction. The process was designed to strip away hesitation, mercy, and fear. Recruits were broken down physically and mentally, their individuality crushed until only obedience, endurance, and aggression remained. In the sweltering camps of Paris Island and San Diego, instructors screamed until their voices broke, forcing men to crawl through mud, fight exhaustion, and master every weapon they touched. Every mistake was punished, every weakness exposed. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was preparation for the kind of warfare that would test the limits of human will. By the time these men earned the title Marine, they were different. They could endure heat, hunger, pain, and loss, and still keep moving forward. When the Marines arrived in the Pacific, their training met its brutal purpose. The islands they were sent to conquer were not battlefields in the traditional sense. They were hellscapes of mud, coral, jungle, and death. Every inch was fortified by an enemy that would not surrender. The Japanese soldier, too, had been shaped by merciless conditioning. From childhood, he was taught that his life belonged to the emperor. Failure was unforgivable, and surrender was worse than death. In many ways, the Japanese and the Marines were mirror images, each bred to destroy, each convinced of his own superiority. But while the Japanese fought with emotional zeal, the Marines fought with cold precision. They didn't charge blindly into gunfire. They advanced systematically, clearing bunkers one by one, turning every stronghold into rubble. The Marines' adaptability became one of their greatest weapons. Where the Japanese relied on discipline and obedience to rigid tactics, Marines were encouraged to think independently. A corporal in the field could make decisions that changed the outcome of a skirmish. When communication lines broke or officers fell, they didn't freeze, they acted. That flexibility often shattered Japanese expectations. Their commanders couldn't comprehend how small units of Marines could continue to fight effectively, even when cut off, wounded, or leaderless. It was as if the entire force shared one mind and one purpose. Their training had also hardened them for the psychological horror of close combat. The Pacific battles weren't fought at long range. They were fought face to face in the darkness of caves and the smoke of trenches. Marines learned to fight with knives, shovels, and even bare hands. They became experts in ambush and infiltration, knowing that hesitation meant death. The Japanese, who had expected Western troops to recoil from such fighting, were stunned by the ferocity of these encounters. Reports from the front described Marines who charged into bunkers under fire, who fought on after being hit, who dragged wounded comrades out of flames and went back for more. To the Japanese, it was unnatural, a violation of how war was supposed to unfold. The Marine Corps also fostered something far deeper than discipline, a shared identity. Every Marine was taught that the Corps came before self. The bond between Marines was unbreakable, And that unity gave them a kind of strength that no amount of ideology could replicate. A Japanese soldier might die for his emperor, but a Marine would die for the man beside him. That difference mattered. It created a force driven not by blind obedience but by trust, a bond so powerful that it made them fearless. By the time word of these encounters spread through Japanese ranks, the image of the Marine had changed from that of an enemy soldier to something closer to a nightmare. The Japanese could understand courage, even fanaticism, but they struggled to understand the calm, relentless aggression of men who didn't seek glory or honor, only victory. The Marines didn't fight to die. They fought to win. And that, more than anything, made them terrifying opponents. When the Marines first met the Japanese in real battle, the world watched the birth of a legend. The island of Guadalcanal in 1942 was where both forces came face to face for the first time on a large scale, and what began as a desperate defense quickly turned into a brutal proving ground. For months, under rain, heat, and constant attack, the Marines fought off a relentless enemy that refused to give up. The Japanese came in waves, charging through jungle and across open fields in suicidal banzai attacks, believing they could crush the Americans through sheer will. But what they found waiting for them was not fear, it was fire. The Marines met every charge with machine guns, grenades, and raw fury. They learned fast that in this kind of war, mercy was a weakness neither side could afford. The Japanese commanders were stunned by what they saw. They had expected the Americans to retreat, to crack under the pressure of exhaustion and terror. Instead, they encountered soldiers who dug in, who fought back even when starving, who used captured weapons when their own ammunition ran low. Guadalcanal became a nightmare for Japanese forces. The Marines refused to be pushed off that island, no matter how many times the enemy tried. At night, the jungle echoed with screams, gunfire, and the pounding of artillery. Both sides fought like animals, but it was the Marines who adapted to the chaos. They learned to move silently, to ambush, to strike with sudden violence and then vanish back into the trees. Every encounter left the Japanese more shaken, more uncertain of their own superiority. One Japanese officer later described the Marines as demons who did not know fear. Even when wounded, they kept firing. Even when surrounded, they refused to surrender. This defiance was something the Japanese had not encountered before. Their doctrine was built on psychological dominance, terrifying the enemy into retreat or submission through shock and fanaticism. But the Marines could not be intimidated. The more savage the battle became, the harder they fought. They absorbed every blow and struck back twice as hard. The Japanese began to realize they were facing a force as unyielding as themselves, one that did not rely on divine duty or imperial command, but on sheer determination. As the fighting dragged on, the Marines developed a deep respect for their enemy's courage, even as they learned how to break it. They discovered that the Japanese would fight to the last man, often refusing to surrender even when completely outnumbered. So the Marines changed their tactics. They stopped expecting the enemy to give up, and started planning to wipe out every position entirely. Every hill, cave, and bunker became a small war of its own, fought with grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonets. It was war stripped of distance, reduced to primal survival, and in that kind of fight, the Marines thrived. They learned to control their fear and use it as fuel. They fought with a cold focus that made them terrifying to face. By the time the Japanese finally withdrew from Guadalcanal, the legend of the Marines had already begun to spread across the Pacific. Word traveled fast among Japanese units that the Americans who wore those helmets and carried those rifles were not like other soldiers. They didn't just win battles, they erased resistance. The fear was not just of dying, but of dying without victory, without honor, at the hands of an enemy who would not yield. For the Japanese, Guadalcanal shattered the illusion of invincibility. For the Marines, it was the moment they proved to the world and to themselves that no matter how brutal the fight, they would always stand their ground. After Guadalcanal, every island the Marines landed on became a new chapter in a growing legend of endurance and blood. The Pacific was a chain of nightmares, each one worse than the last. The names alone, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, came to define the savagery of the war. Every one of those islands was a fortress, defended by Japanese soldiers who had dug into the earth, prepared to die rather than surrender. The Marines knew what awaited them every time they stepped off their landing crafts. Machine guns hidden in coral, mines buried under the sand, and enemy fire so thick it turned the beaches into killing fields. Yet they went anyway, wave after wave, driven by the belief that no obstacle, no matter how deadly, could stop them. Tarawa was the first to show just how far that belief could go. The Japanese had spent months turning the tiny atoll into a maze of bunkers, trenches, and steel. When the Marines landed, the tide was too low for their landing crafts, forcing many to wade hundreds of yards through waist-deep water under direct fire. Men fell by the hundreds before they even reached the shore, but still they pushed forward. For 3 days the battle raged. The Japanese fought to the last man, and the Marines fought for every inch of sand. When it was over, the beach was littered with bodies, but the American flag flew above the ruins. Tarawa had cost thousands of lives for just a few square miles of land. But it proved something vital. The Marines could take any position, no matter the cost. Saipan and Peleliu pushed that endurance even further. On Saipan, the Marines faced not only soldiers, but civilians who had been told that Americans were monsters. Families jumped off cliffs rather than surrender. It was a horrifying sight that left many Marines shaken, but more determined than ever to end the war. On Peleliu, the heat was so intense that men collapsed before the fighting even began. And the Japanese had perfected underground defense, turning the island into a network of tunnels and caves. The Marines had to root them out one by one, burning them out with flamethrowers, sealing tunnels with explosives. It was a kind of warfare that defied logic, where victory meant total destruction. Then came Iwo Jima, the mountain of black volcanic ash that would become one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The Japanese commander there, General Kuribayashi, knew he could not win, but he intended to make the Americans pay for every foot of ground. For 36 days, the Marines fought through an inferno of gunfire, artillery, and ambushes. They faced an enemy they could rarely see, hidden in bunkers carved into the earth. Each advance was measured in yards, each night filled with the sound of explosions and screams. But the Marines did not stop. They climbed, they crawled, they fought until they reached the top of Mount Suribachi and raised the flag, a moment that captured the very essence of their will. To the Japanese, that flag meant more than victory. It meant that nothing they built, no defense they created could stop the Marines from coming. Each of these battles broke the myth of Japanese invincibility further. The soldiers who survived carried stories of Marines who fought like men possessed, who came out of the smoke when all seemed lost. The Japanese began to dread the sound of naval bombardment, followed by the thunder of boots on the beach. They knew who it was. It was the Marines. And when the Marines landed, there was no escape, only a fight that ended in death. The hatred the Japanese felt was born from that helplessness, from knowing that these Americans would fight them on their own terms and win. By the war's middle years, the name Marine had become a warning whispered across every island. They were coming, and there would be no mercy. As the island battles intensified, the struggle between Marines and Japanese soldiers evolved beyond mere physical warfare. It became a contest of minds, spirit, and psychological endurance. By 1944, the Japanese no longer underestimated the Americans, but they still believed in their own moral and spiritual superiority. They thought their willingness to die for the emperor gave them an unbreakable edge. Yet the Marines shattered that illusion by proving that survival, not death, could be just as powerful a form of courage. The Japanese expected to terrify the enemy with suicidal charges, night infiltrations, and fanatical resistance, but the Marines refused to be intimidated. They met fanaticism with cold resolve and turned every act of desperation into an opportunity to strike back harder. Night was the Japanese domain. They believed that darkness was their ally, that the enemy would fear what lurked beyond the flickering light of campfires. On island after island, they tried to reclaim lost ground through sudden night assaults, silent movements followed by chaotic screams of "Banzai!" as hundreds rushed forward with bayonets and swords. In earlier wars, such charges had broken the will of opponents. But against the Marines, they became suicide missions. The Marines learned to expect them. They dug in, set up interlocking fields of fire, and waited with fingers on triggers. When the charges came, the night erupted into thunder. Machine guns tore through the darkness, flares lit the sky, and the attackers fell by the dozens. By dawn, the beaches and jungles were littered with bodies. What had once been a tool of terror now became a symbol of futility. The psychological toll of fighting the Marines grew heavier with each defeat. Japanese survivors described Marines as creatures of endless endurance, men who would not rest until the last bunker was cleared. They fought like machines but with the fury of beasts. Their calm under pressure unnerved even the most disciplined Japanese units. Marines didn't panic when ambushed. They counterattacked. They didn't fear the suicidal charge. They anticipated it, and when their own positions were overrun, they regrouped and came back. This relentless persistence began to erode the morale of Japanese troops who had been taught that Americans were weak and spoiled. Instead, they found themselves facing enemies who were not only strong but terrifyingly indifferent to pain and death. Propaganda on both sides intensified the psychological war. The Japanese government portrayed the Marines as monsters, bloodthirsty demons who would torture and kill without hesitation. But on the battlefield, soldiers learned a different truth. The Marines were ruthless, yes, but they were also disciplined. They fought hard, but they didn't waste lives. They could be merciless in combat, but when the fighting ended, they didn't mutilate or mock. That confused and angered Japanese soldiers, who had been promised that the Americans were savages without honor. The realization that their own leaders had lied added a new layer of despair to their fear. For the Marines, the psychological challenge was just as immense. They faced an enemy that refused to surrender, that played dead to draw them in, that detonated grenades under their own bodies rather than be captured. Sleep was rare, nerves were stretched thin, and death could come from any shadow. Yet through it all, Marine discipline held. They leaned on each other, on gallows humor, on the shared promise that no man would be left behind. That unity kept them human in a place where humanity was constantly stripped away. In time, the Japanese learned that Marines did not fear death because they fought for something more tangible than honor. They fought for each other, for survival, and for victory. That truth was far more terrifying than fanaticism. The Japanese could not comprehend how men without divine cause could fight with such ferocity, and that misunderstanding became their undoing. They had prepared for enemies who would fear them. What they found instead were men who simply refused to stop coming, no matter how many fell. To fight the Marines was to fight inevitability itself, and that realization haunted the Japanese until the war's bitter end. By the time the war reached its final stages, the Japanese military had learned a hard truth. Facing the Marines was not just a battle for land, but a fight for sanity. The psychological pressure on Japanese soldiers was immense. Each time they faced the Marines, they knew what awaited them. Endless bombardment, close-quarters combat, and an enemy that did not yield. The Marines had mastered a rhythm of warfare that combined brute strength with tactical precision. Naval guns would thunder for hours, planes would rain fire from above, and then when the smoke lifted, the Marines would come ashore, silent, coordinated, and merciless. There was no escape. For the Japanese, it felt like being crushed by an unstoppable machine. The Marines fought in a way that defied everything the Japanese had been taught to expect. In their code, Americans were supposed to be soft, unwilling to endure suffering, incapable of matching Japan's spiritual discipline. Yet every battle proved the opposite. When the Marines were wounded, they fought on. When they were trapped, they found a way out. When they were outnumbered, they dug in and refused to die quietly. They did not fight for an emperor or a divine cause. They fought for survival, for their brothers beside them, and for victory. That gave them a kind of strength the Japanese could not understand. Their loyalty was not upward to a distant ruler, it was horizontal to the men around them. And that kind of loyalty made them terrifyingly resilient. On islands like Okinawa, the scale of destruction reached levels no one could have imagined. The Japanese had turned the island into a fortress, knowing it was the last barrier before the homeland. When the Marines landed, they faced not only entrenched soldiers but also civilians caught in the crossfire. The Japanese army encouraged civilians to fight or die rather than surrender. It was total war. Every cave, every ridge, every farmhouse became a battlefield. The Marines advanced slowly, grinding down the defenses yard by yard. The Japanese launched banzai attacks, suicide missions, and kamikaze strikes from the skies. Yet nothing could stop the Americans from advancing. The Marines' discipline and coordination held firm under unimaginable stress. The more the Japanese resisted, the harder the Marines pushed. The battle became a symbol of pure endurance. A horrifying contest of wills that left both sides broken, but the Japanese utterly defeated. By now, the Japanese soldiers' hatred for the Marines was no longer just rooted in nationalism. It came from deep psychological exhaustion. The Marines represented everything they feared: adaptability, efficiency, and the ability to match their own fanaticism with cold, methodical destruction. The Japanese fought for ideals. The Marines fought for results. And results in war always win. The Japanese officers began to recognize this difference. Reports intercepted later in the war showed that many had come to respect, even admire, the Marines' skill. They described them as devils in human form, not out of superstition but as a grim acknowledgement of their effectiveness. They could not be intimidated, bribed, or broken. They simply came and kept coming until the last defender fell. The terrain itself seemed to favor the Japanese. Dense jungles, volcanic rock, hidden caves. But the Marines turned those same obstacles into opportunities. They adapted to every environment, learning to fight in mud, coral, or lava fields. They invented new tactics on the spot, using flamethrowers to clear tunnels and tanks fitted with bulldozer blades to crush fortifications. The Japanese saw this creativity as a kind of dark magic, an enemy who could change tactics faster than they could respond. In their minds, the Marines became symbols of inevitable defeat, not because of sheer power, but because of their relentless will to win at any cost. As the war drew closer to Japan's shores, the soldiers stationed there dreaded one thing above all: a Marine invasion. They had seen what happened on Saipan and Okinawa. They knew that if the Marines landed on the home islands, it would mean total destruction. That fear seeped into every corner of the Japanese military mindset. It wasn't just the Americans they feared. It was specifically the Marines. They were not faceless enemies anymore. They were the living embodiment of the war itself, unstoppable, unyielding, and mercilessly efficient. The Japanese hated them because they could not beat them. And in war, there is no greater humiliation than realizing that your greatest strength, your willingness to die, means nothing against an enemy who simply refuses to lose.